Hello, and welcome back to the channel. In this seventh video of the playlist, we'll talk about Freud's thoughts on identification. Ready? Let's go! Identification is known to psychoanalysis as the earliest expression of an emotional attachment to another person. It plays a part in the prehistory of the Oedipus complex. The small boy exhibits a special interest in his father, wanting to become like him, be like him, take his place in every respect. Not to put too fine a point on it, he takes his father as his ideal. This behavior has nothing to do with a passive or feminine attitude towards the father, and towards the male sex in general. In fact, it is exquisitely masculine. It is wholly consistent with the Oedipus complex, which it helps to prepare. At the same time as this identification with his father, possibly even earlier, the boy has begun to undertake a true object charging of his mother, in accordance with the support-seeking type. In other words, he evinces two psychologically different attachments. To his mother, a straightforwardly sexual object charging. To his father, an exemplary identification. For a while, the two exist in parallel, without influencing or interfering with each other. In consequence of the inexorable standardization of mental life, they eventually meet, and this coming together gives rise to the normal Oedipus complex. The boy notices that, for him, his father bars the way to his mother. His identification with his father now assumes a hostile note and becomes identical with the desire to take his father's place with his mother too. The fact is, identification is ambivalent from the outset. It can as easily turn into an expression of tenderness as into a wish to remove. It behaves like a product of the first oral stage of libido organization, in which the coveted, treasured object was incorporated by eating, and was annihilated as such in the process. The cannibal, as we know, never gets beyond this point. He loves to eat his enemies, and he does not eat those he cannot somehow hold in affection. The fate of this father identification is later easily lost from view. It may then happen that the Oedipus complex suffers an inversion, that the father is in a feminine mindset, taken as the object from which the direct sexual drives expect satisfaction, and father identification has then become the precursor of object attachment to the father. The same applies mutatis mutandis with regard to the small daughter. It is a simple matter to express the difference between this kind of father identification and choice of the father as an object in a formula. In the former instance, the father is what the child wishes to be, in the latter, what the child wants to have. It is the difference, in other words, between whether the attachment fixes on the subject or the object of the eye. The former is therefore possible before any sexual object choice. It is very much harder to illustrate the difference metapsychologically. All that is understood is that identification tries to shape a person's own I along similar lines to the other that the person has taken as his example. We extract identification from a more intricate context in the case of neurotic symptom formation. The young girl we should like to dwell on now suffers, she says, from the same symptoms as her mother, for instance, the same painful cough. Now, this may happen in various ways. Either the identification is the same as from the Oedipus complex, implying a hostile desire to replace the mother, and the symptom expresses the object love for the father. It affects the replacement of the mother under the influence of guilt feelings. You wanted to be your mother. Now you are, at least in terms of illness. That is then the complete mechanism of hysterical symptom formation. Or alternatively, the symptom is the same as that of the loved person, as when, for instance, Dora, in Fragment of an Analysis of Hysteria, imitates her father's coughing. In that case, the only way we can describe the facts of the case is by saying, identification has taken the place of choice of object. Object choice has regressed to become identification. We have heard that identification is the earliest and most natural form of emotional attachment. In the circumstances of symptom formation, i.e., of repression, and of the dominance of the mechanisms of the unconscious, it often happens that object choice once again becomes identification. That is to say, the I takes on the qualities of the object. Remarkably, in such identifications, the I will on one occasion copy the unloved person, on another the loved person. Another thing that inevitably strikes us is that on both occasions, the identification is partial and highly restricted, borrowing only a single feature from the object person. A third Particularly frequent and significant case of symptom formation is when identification wholly disregards the object relationship to the person copied. If, for example, one of the girls in a boarding school has received a letter from her secret lover that provokes her jealousy and to which she reacts with a fit of hysteria, some of her friends who are in the know will adopt the fit, as we say, through the medium of psychical infection. The mechanism is that of identification on the basis of being able to or wanting to put oneself in the same position. The others would also like to have a secret love affair, and under the influence of guilt feelings, they also accept the associated illness. It would be wrong to say that they appropriate the symptom out of sympathy. On the contrary, sympathy springs only from identification, and the proof is that such infection or imitation is sometimes also engendered where presumably there was less prior fellow feeling between the two parties than customarily exists among female boarding school friends. One I has perceived in the other a significant analogy in one point, in our example in the same emotional readiness, whereupon an identification forms in that point and under the influence of the pathogenic situation, that identification shifts to become a symptom that the first I has produced. Identification through the symptom thus becomes a sign of an overlap between the two I's that must be kept repressed. What we have learned from these three sources can be summed up as follows. Firstly, identification is the most natural form of emotional attachment to an object. Secondly, through regressive channels, it becomes a substitute for a libidinal object attachment, as it were by introjection of the object into the I. And thirdly, it may arise in connection with every newly perceived instance of having something in common with a person who is not an object of the sex drives. The more significant that having something in common, the more successful this partial identification must be capable of becoming, so corresponding to the beginning of a fresh attachment. We already suspect that the reciprocal attachment of the individuals making up a mass is in the nature of such an identification through their having a great deal in common emotionally, and we may assume that what they have in common consists in the manner of their attachment to the leader. Another suspicion may tell us that we are a long way from having exhausted the problem of identification, that we are faced here with the process that psychology calls empathy, and that contributes most towards our understanding of the non-I element in other persons. For our present purposes, however, we mean to confine ourselves to the most immediate effective influences of identification, and to disregard its importance for our intellectual life. Psychoanalytical research, which has occasionally also tackled the more difficult problems of psychoses, has also been able to show us identification in a number of other cases not easily amenable to our understanding. I shall deal with two of these cases in detail as material for our further considerations. The genesis of male homosexuality is, in a great many instances, as follows. The young man has been fixated on his mother in terms of the Oedipus complex for an unusually long time and with unusual intensity. Finally, with puberty at last complete, the time comes to exchange the mother for a different sex object. Here an abrupt reversal occurs. Instead of leaving his mother, the youth identifies with her, transforming himself into her, and henceforth seeking objects capable of taking the place of his I for him, objects that he can love and care for in the way he has learned to do from his mother. This is a frequent occurrence. It can be confirmed any number of times and is, of course, wholly independent of any assumption that may be made regarding the organic driving force and the motives behind that sudden change. What is striking about this identification is its extensiveness. It transforms the I in an extremely important respect, in its sexual character, on the model of the existing object. In the process, the object itself is relinquished. Whether completely or only in the sense that it is retained in the unconscious is not at issue here. For us, however, identification with the relinquished or lost object as a replacement for the same, what we call introjection of that object into the I, is no longer anything new. Occasionally, this kind of occurrence can be observed directly in the young child. Just such an observation was recently published in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, where a child, unhappy at the loss of a kitten, announced straight out that he was now the kitten himself, and accordingly walked on all fours, refused to sit up at table, etc. Another example of this kind of introjection of the object was provided by our analysis of melancholy. An affect that, of course, counts the real or effective loss of the loved object among its most conspicuous occasions. A major characteristic of these cases is cruel self-disparagement of the I in conjunction with unsparing self-criticism and instances of bitter self-reproach. Studies have shown that such evaluation and such reproaches are basically aimed at the object and represent the revenge of the I upon it. The shadow of the object has fallen on the I, as the present author has written elsewhere. The introjection of the object is here unmistakably plain. But such accesses of melancholy show us something else that may be important as regards our subsequent reflections. They show us the I divided, split in two, with one part raging against the other. This other part is the one changed by introjection, the part that includes the lost object. But the part that rages so cruelly is not unknown to us either. It includes the conscience, a critical agency within the I, which even in normal times adopted a critical stance vis-a-vis the I, only never so implacably and so unfairly. We have already had to make the assumption on previous occasions, narcissism, mourning, and melancholia, that such an agency develops within our I that can cut itself off from the other I and come into conflict with it. We called it the I ideal and attributed to it such functions as self-observation, moral conscience, dream censorship, and the principal influence in repression. We said it was the heir to the original narcissism in which the infant I was self-sufficient. Little by little, we went on, it takes from the influences of the environment those demands that the environment makes upon the I, and that the I is not always able to meet, with the result that where a person cannot himself be content with his I, that person may still find satisfaction in the I ideal as distinct from the I. In observation mania, we further ascertained the disintegration of this agency becomes manifest, and in the process its derivation from the influences of the authorities, primarily the parents, is exposed. We did not omit to add, however, that the distance between this I ideal and the actual I varies greatly between individuals, and that for many this differentiation within the I goes no further than in the child. But before we can use this material to help us to understand the libidinal organization of a mass, we need to consider a number of other correlations between object and I. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check the books available in our link in the description. There you'll find many fundamental marketing books in different languages. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more psychology-related content. See you in the next one.